record penalties for protesters, dire straits for the NHS and dashed hopes for the so-called Red Rebel Alliance. I'm Coco Khan.
And I'm Nish and this is Pod Save the UK. Today, we're hearing Extinction Rebellion co-founder Clare Farrell's thoughts on the record sentences dished out to 5 Just Stop Oil campaigners.
And later, we're speaking to the chair of the NHS Federation Victor Adebowale to find out how we can fix our broken NHS. But first, you are probably not going to like this one.
In 6 months' time, I hope that the cap has been abolished. And in that time, I will obviously go through the process with the party and continue to stick to my principles and speak up for my constituents who re-elected me to champion causes such as scrapping the 2-child benefit cap.
So in that clip from Radio 4's Today programme, that's Zara Sultana, the recently re-elected MP that last night was suspended from the Labour Party after voting against the government. Here's what happened. On Tuesday evening, 7 left-wing Labour MPs, known as the Red Rebels, formed a rebellion voting on an SNP amendment to the King's Speech to drop the 2-child benefit cap, a policy put in place by the Tory government way back in 2017. Nevertheless, the government easily passed the bill thanks to its monster majority, but that's not the big story.
No, the big story is that the Labour leadership suspended the whip from those 7 rebels, meaning they've been suspended from the party. A review will take place in 6 months, pending an investigation. Now, of course, we've spoken about the 2-child benefit cap a lot on this show, but just to refresh you, it caps the potential benefits received by families that have more than 2 children, with some very minor exceptions. It's a really cruel policy that only harms the most vulnerable in our society. Who's more vulnerable than children? And it is furthering the conditions of poverty in that group.
Estimates put the cost of reversing the policy somewhere in the ballpark of £3.4 billion, which is certainly a lot of money. But if the government wanted to make it work in consideration to other spending commitments, it absolutely could. And the policy only applies to families with 3 or more children born after the policy was implemented. But when fully rolled out, it would affect about 1 in 10 families, or nearly 3 million children.
Now, look, we've talked on this show about, rebranding tax. Why is tax spoken about so negatively? Tax is cool, tax is sexy. And I don't know about you, but I think there is nothing cooler or sexier or more urgent or morally imperative than taking children out of poverty.
The government itself is also, had been previously seen to be faltering on the issue. After not including it in the King's Speech last Wednesday, in the hours before the debates began, the government announced a child poverty task force, perhaps hoping to stifle the criticism of their stance. Then on Monday, the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, hinted that the 2-child benefit cap might be going, backed up by comments from the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. However, Rachel Reeves told Cabinet colleagues on Tuesday ahead of the vote that difficult decisions on public spending need to be made. There are backbenchers who potentially agree with the 7 rebels. 42 members abstained from the vote yesterday, and a few weeks ago, the new Labour MP, Torsten Bell, told this podcast that the 2-child benefit is something that all Labour MPs want to see gone. Look, it's likely that we will see a reversal of this policy in due course, as this will continue to be a thorn in the side of the new government and its newly established Child Poverty Task Force, because reversing this policy is one of the quickest and cheapest ways to begin to reverse the growing rate of child poverty. Returning to the sort of politics of this, Labour suspending the whip from the 7 rebels will create a chilling effect for the prospect of other backbenchers speaking out.
Which is the point, right? That's why they did it. That's precisely the point. They want to create a chilling effect, and they want to show that this is a party where any deviation from their line will not be tolerated.
Yeah. It's very reminiscent of Dominic Cummings at his most kind of control freaky.
Yeah. And it's weird as well because, I can't get over the fact that Labour has an enormous majority. So it doesn't actually need to have these 7 rebels. It doesn't make a blind bit of difference. Really, it's a show of power and a kind of message to lots of disaffected Labour voters that actually you may have voted Labour in the past because of the broad church, but it's not that anymore, baby.
Yeah, I also just think there's things to talk about with the 2-child benefit cap, only because there's lots of anti-poverty campaigners that have been stressing this morning that is not a silver bullet, that whilst we absolutely should get rid of it, and there really should be no greater emergency in this country than lifting children out of poverty. Yeah. There's some positivity about the idea of an anti-poverty task force specifically to look at this stuff. But I would also say I just don't understand the logic of suspending MPs. you have the majority. You won this huge voting block that essentially means you can pass whatever legislation you want. Why create an antagonism within the Labour Party? Why create an antagonism within the Labour movement? They're going to have to raise this benefit cap. Okay, that's just going to go, because ultimately, as much as we talk about £3.4 billion as a seemingly huge sum of money, in the grand scheme of the public finances, it's not that huge a sum of money as a price to pay for lifting children out of poverty. And if you want to get something done very quickly, this is the fastest way to do it. In terms of the suspension of MPs, the whole point of Keir Starmer having this enormous majority was that he would be able to pass legislation.
Yeah.
And, at some point in the life cycle of this parliament, Keir Starmer is going to come under concerted political pressure from the political right and maybe even from the political centre. And he is going to need the support of the broad church. If he keeps on prizing loyalty above everything else, the Conservative Party has given you a very serious lesson on where that leaves you.
I mean,
it leaves you lacking competence. Like the problem with Johnson and Cummings is that they kept on purging the party of people that did not toe their line. And when you prize loyalty above all else, you end up with a cabinet of incompetence. And that is a really, really important political point within this bigger conversation where the focus should be on how do we get as many children out of poverty as quickly as possible.
And it's interesting because I've actually seen some Conservative MPs, including Suella Braverman, point to Labour's hypocrisy on this issue. I can't believe it's one that they haven't resolved at the opportunity that they could, And again, just going back to this prioritising of fiscal responsibility, poverty costs in the end, in terms of like NHS costs, in terms of social service costs, in terms of lack of productivity of those younger people as they reach working age and the problems that they will face. Like, it's cost effective, like you said, to do this. And so in a way, it's just like the argument for ending the 2-child benefit cap has already been made. It's already been won in the public domain. I don't know why wouldn't you take it? And then my final thought, I would just say, for the MPs that got suspended, fair play to them for voting with their conscience there. I respect it very much. And I also think that given that they're from constituencies where that issue is very pronounced, I mean, what would you expect? How would they face their constituents? How would they look them in the eye? I mean... in a way, I would argue this goes so far as to be disrespectful to voters.
But now, moving on from a backbench rebellion to public protest, we have a very special guest joining us on the couch.
Now, on Thursday last week, record sentences were handed down to 5 activists from Just Stop Oil. The co-founder of Just Stop Oil, Roger Hallam, was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, while the other 4 defendants, Daniel Shaw, Louise Lancaster, Lucia Whitaker de Abreu and Cressida Gethin, were handed 4 years imprisonment.
Now, it's worth taking a moment to catch up on what is alleged to have happened here. Prosecutors said that the defendants joined a Zoom call in early November 2022 in which discussions were held about 4 days of planned protests, and that they were aiming to recruit others for those protests. A journalist from The Sun, that organ of ceaseless veracity, who had dialed in looking for a scoop, recorded some of the conversation and passed it along to the police.
The protests went ahead and saw 45 people climb the M25's gantries. That's those big metal constructions that hang over the motorways, the ones that have got the signs and the cameras on them, which prosecutors allege led to an economic cost of at least £765,000, with cost to the police of more than £1.1 million. The demonstration allegedly affected more than 700,000 vehicles and caused over 50,000 cumulative hours of delays.
Judge Christopher Hare, when passing down the sentence, said, "I acknowledge that at least some of the concerns motivating you are, at least to some extent, shared by many. But the plain fact is that each of you has some time ago crossed the line from concerned campaigner to fanatic. You have appointed yourselves as the sole arbiters of what should be done about climate change, bound neither by the principles of democracy nor the rule of law."
Now, the activities of Just Stop Oil have divided the public and the media. Some have called the sentences just, others have said that they shouldn't have done it, while others, notably environmental energy magnate Dale Vince and previous guest on this show, Chris Packham, have demanded an urgent meeting with the new Attorney General, Richard Hermer Casey.
In reaction to the sentencing, Michelle Forst, the UN Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders, said that today is a dark day for peaceful environmental protest. When the convictions were made, he also suggested that the ruling might be in breach of international law. So, joining us to discuss these sentences and what it means for our democracy is Clare Farrell, British environmental activist and co-founder of the Extinction Rebellion movement. Welcome, Claire.
Thanks for having me.
So, Claire, you have a one-of-a-kind perspective on this, not just in terms of your environmental activism, but also just in terms of you've actually been in the dock.
Yeah.
You have been the subject of a court case where the jurors acquitted you. So you were arrested for civil disobedience as part of a campaign to fight air pollution in 2017, then again in 2019 for blocking private jet passengers' entrance to London City Airport. That's what you were charged for, found guilty of obstruction, have I got that right?
Mm-hmm.
And given a 6-month conditional discharge, which was later overturned. And then in 2023, you were found not guilty before a jury for breaking glass windows of HSBC in 2021. So you know this process very, very well. Looking at these sentences that have just been handed down, how unusual are they?
Fucking unusual.
Right.
Unprecedented.
Right.
You know, and the judge who handed them out has jumped off the back of the sentencing of 2 other people, Morgan and Marcus, who hung on the QE2 bridge in hammocks, and they got the sort of first deterrent sort of hardcore sentencing that we saw for climate protest in this country, using the guidelines that have come from the new legislation that's been introduced by the Conservatives over the last couple of years.
Yeah, we should summarise that new legislation. So the Johnson government passed the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act in 2022, which introduced the statutory offence of public nuisance, which is what the 5 Just Stop Oil protesters were sentenced upon. Though, given that it was introduced by the Boris Johnson government, I'm not sure he wants to start a conversation about being a nuisance to the fucking public in this country. But that isn't the only draconian legacy of the past government. The other big one is the Public Order Act of 2023, which is introduced by Johnson, but then passed by Sunak's government, which clamped further down on disruptive protesting like that carried out by Just Stop Oil. There might be some interested parties at play in this one. According to Politico, Rishi Sunak admitted to the policy being drafted, at least in part, by Policy Exchange, a right-wing think tank whose funding is unbelievably transparent. Wait, I've made a mistake there. It's incredibly murky and no one knows where the money comes from. At least some of it coming from oil-related interests. On the second ever episode of this show, Paul Powsland, who's a lawyer and is something of an expert in this field, had warned us that those 2 pieces of legislation were leading us potentially down quite a dark and draconian path. And this is, Claire, effectively validating those things that he said to us, right?
Yeah, precisely. And what I've been trying to explain to people about the story of this trial that we've just seen, the sentencing, for me, you know, the story itself of this trial begins obviously with this sting by this Sun journalist who's been bragging and gloating online, as far as I can see, about how pleased they are about the sentencing and all of this kind of stuff. But actually,
at least the Sun doesn't have a incredibly horrible record of working with the police to deliver incredibly terrible things.
Precisely.
Nobody Google Hillsborough.
Yeah. And also don't look at the Daniel Morgan inquiry.
Don't look at it.
Apart from that being like the sort of technical beginning of this charge for these activists, if you go back to 2019, Policy Exchange wrote a paper called Extremism Rebellion, which was an outline of this direction of travel. And the reason that they wrote it was because Extinction Rebellion was being so phenomenally successful, because we had a huge amount of kind of research from various people in the movement. We understood that if you design the right nonviolent strategy, you're on the right side of history, you keep your nonviolent discipline, you can make it inclusive, popular, family-friendly, and a whole load of design aspects to it, then you can expect to win in the long run. And perhaps you look at something like the civil rights in the States and you think, well, we haven't got the time that these things took to win, but nonetheless, we've got a strategy, we've got a momentum-driven mobilization, it's working, you know, and I think in all likelihood, big industry, and particularly the fossil fuel sector, shat their pants and thought, we have to shut this down. And they've read all the same strategy books as we have. So they've got extremely sophisticated variety of approaches in the pushback. But the ultimate kind of part that can prevent the kinds of actions that we've been doing has taken several years for them to put into place. And that really is the backbone of the thinking and what's led to this legislation. And of course, Policy Exchange come up again and again and again throughout this whole sort of story, if you look back over the last sort of 5 years or so.
I really just want to drill into and just make it clear to our listeners and to myself about how what is happening now is unusual and is something that is going to have ongoing ripples out into all areas of protest. So I suppose my question is, thinking back to those court cases that you had, if these bills were in place then, do you think you'd be sitting here now?
Possibly not, although those bills, they're not designed to deal with property damage.
Right.
So the main thing they're drafted for is public disruption, because they were so concerned about the level of, I think, the level of awareness that you can raise by being very disruptive. I mean, when we shut down central London in early 2019, it did make the climate crisis a massive issue where it hadn't been before. The school strikes obviously were part of this kind of cumulative swell. David Attenborough started talking about things in quite a different way.
Yeah.
Had a heat wave in 2018. There was a lot of sort of contributing factors. It wasn't all us, but we definitely saw then, this declaration of climate and ecological emergency by the Parliament. But it was definitely true that the disruptive part is the thing that gives you the drama, the jeopardy, and the newsworthiness. So if you go and do bad things to bad people, like, you go and punish the fossil fuel companies by protesting at them, no one pays any attention, really. You can see the drama of us breaking a window of a bank, a group of women, that makes people pay attention. Just Stop Oil blocked a lot of oil terminals, and people would say, why don't you go and block the carbon? Why don't you go and stop the people who are doing the thing? But you don't get on the news. No one reported it. They almost caused a fuel shortage in southeast of England, and it wasn't news. And they did it by climbing on trucks, digging tunnels, going into the depots. It's not a story, according to the media.
Let's talk a little bit briefly about Michel Forst's comments. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders. What did he mean when he said this could be potentially in breach of international law?
Well, the new legislation, when it came in, there were a lot of criticisms of the fact that it conflicted with certain things that are standard practice in the UK and a ruling called Ziegler, which is kind of a technical point on law, but like basically a ruling that said if you disrupt a road, you have to consider the proportionality of that disruption compared with what you're trying to prevent.
Yeah.
And it's possible for you to have a reasonable excuse or a legitimate route to an acquittal because perhaps you were trying to stop a genocide and all you did was block a truck, for example, right? So that piece of ruling, the Ziegler ruling, has been an issue for the establishment, let's say, because it makes it legitimate to block a road, and they wanted to make it not legitimate. In international human rights, you have a right to express yourself, you have a right to take up space, you have a right to be obstructive, you have a right to make a noise, you have a right to do these things, and you have a right to then argue why you did them. And a lot of the new legislation in this country has come into conflict with those rights because it effectively means that you don't have them anymore. And for example, in my trial, we broke the windows of HSBC headquarters. The trial was scheduled for a certain date and then it was delayed. So it was delayed because the government appealed the Coulston case. So, the Coulston statue that got pulled down in Bristol. They won their case partly because they had an Article 10 defence, which is freedom of expression.
Yeah.
You have the right to choose how you express yourself. Depending on the seriousness of what you're trying to express, you can choose how to do that.
Yeah.
Then because you can choose how to do that, you can bring in an expert witness to testify to your beliefs. So I'm not mental. Right. This guy really was a horrible slave owner and everyone thinks the statue's a stain on our city. Yeah. Or I'm not mad because the climate crisis is definitely happening and everyone's for sure going to fucking die.
Yeah.
And you should take me seriously. But listen to this expert. Let's bring him in.
Yeah.
Or her. And that defence was taken away because the establishment didn't like the fact that the Coulston activists got an acquittal from a jury.
Right.
So I wasn't allowed to use Article 10. So I wasn't allowed to bring in any experts to talk about the financing of fossil fuels, to talk about the environment, to talk about their projects, to talk about climate breakdown, anything. So everything we got to use in court came from us and us alone. We couldn't bring in any expertise to back up what we believe.
And is that what happened in this case as well?
Yeah. And actually the judge went further in this case to say that Professor Bill Maguire, who's a legend and a massive expert on climate risk and what's actually occurring in the breakdown of our world, he was described by the judge as not fit to be a proper expert witness because he was an activist.
Right.
So he was kind of dismissed on an identity basis, which then led Bill to go online and say, if you've ever spoken out as a climate scientist, watch out, because maybe you'll become an activist, and then nobody will care about the fact that you're a professor emeritus.
But if you're a climate scientist and your job is to analyse climate breakdown, does that mean it becomes activism if you report what's happening?
Well, exactly.
It doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. And I think that's what, for me, that's what happens in the legal system, particularly in this context. The system ties itself in quite a lot of knots where you have a circumstance which is unprecedented, runs in conflict with the perpetuation of everything being kept exactly the same, which is basically what a lot of the law is trying to do. It's trying to keep things the same.
Yeah.
And it's quite hard to change it, which may be a good thing a lot of the time, right? That you don't want to just wildly easily change laws and move the goalposts all the time. But in a circumstance like this, where our civilization is at grave existential threat, and we know that our societies cannot continue like they are because they're in self-termination, then, the law has got basically nothing to say about that. It's only got something to say about people being really annoying. And now, how annoying you can be is being squashed down and down and down.
I definitely don't want there to be laws about being annoying in public. I think that would really negatively impact my career in life. If I'm not allowed to be annoying in public, if that becomes illegal, I'm going to be in jail for the rest of my goddamn life.
Watch out, Nish. It's the direction of travel that we're going on.
I'm so fucking annoying. Jesus Christ.
Annoying.
Yeah.
Annoying for hire. I just want to talk a little bit about Roger Hallam. Obviously, he's a significant leader in the movement. And, you mentioned previously that, you'd been reading about other successful movements in the past. It's been a sort of well-established tactic to take out the leaders of movements, right? That's sort of a thing that happens. And this has happened here. So my first question is, do you think this is a blow that is unrecoverable for XR, for JSO? What has happened here? Do you think this is, it's not a death knell, but how much has it impacted the work you're going to do moving forward? How significant is it? And then the other question I would ask is, what do you think about the argument that the sentences are like almost the point, like they're needed, they're necessary to have this public conversation?
Well, interestingly, I think there are people in history who, like Roger, and I know him really quite well, understood that part of non-violent work can sometimes be to draw the poison and the violence out of a circumstance or a system and get it on the surface where everyone can see it.
Yeah.
And it's a game changer when people witness something that's so blatantly unjust and, some people would say structurally violent. I'm not sure Roger thinks going to prison is violent particularly, but some people experience it as that as well. But it's the point is to sort of pull it out and get it to hit you in public where everyone's watching, so that people go, oh shit, that's what the system does to people, or that's what it can do, that's what it will do. In some senses, these sentences, although the judge may think that they're a big deterrent and that they're really helping, well, that's really shown them, shoeless activists, that they need to all stay at home and shut up.
But they're on motorways. How could they possibly do it without shoes?
It's just a joke that I always make about crusties. We used to have an office with a sign on the wall that said, please wear shoes in the office. I shouldn't have said that. Sorry, XR. But what it's done in their eyes is probably act as this chilling deterrent to say, don't you dare be in this kind of level of resistance where you're basically making it impossible to ignore, which is obviously what the UN Secretary General has told us as the movement that we should do, be impossible to ignore. But also what I think it's done is, it will make some people in Just Stop Oil say, of course we're going to carry on because it's the right thing to do, to carry on this, campaign, to carry on pushing, to push for more, because we're so far into overshoot. We're in borrowed time. It's not like we've got 5 years to change the world. We should have done it 10 years ago. We are massively fucked. So, some people will redouble their efforts to continue finding creative ways to take action. But also it's made everybody realise what these laws were designed to do, and it's enabled a conversation like this.
Well, look, perhaps the most important piece of context for all of this is that Sunday, July the 21st, was the world's hottest ever recorded day. And that piece of information is probably worth setting just in our minds as we have this conversation.
Yeah.
In response to the sentencing of the 5 Just Stop Oil protesters, over 1,200 famous British faces and me have signed an open letter which is addressed to the new Attorney General, Richard Herman KC, following up on Chris Packham and Dale Vince's request for an urgent meeting to discuss the sentences. We will put a link to this in our show notes if you want to sign it. As always, I don't know what the show notes are. I don't know how things go in them. It seems to be low-level witchcraft to me, but that is where the opportunity to involve yourself in this will be. Claire, is there anything else that our listeners might be able to do to make their voices heard?
Well, there's the open letters on 2,000 signatories, as I got a message this morning. So that's just going up and up and up. So I don't know if people can find access to that easily, but there's a petition.
In the show notes,
there's a
wherever
petition.
those are.
There's a petition with Just Stop Oil. There's the open letter. And, I would say that there will be visible protests in the future around this. And there's also really important people talk to each other face to face because, the British public are not who the tabloids tell us that we are. And when you look at the statistics, actually, the vast majority of people think these sentences are wrong. That's what we have to get serious about now, is like thinking about how to construct new systems and new ways of including each other in making decisions and thinking through politics together, because the sort of nexus of the tabloid media and Westminster isn't working for anyone.
Clare Farrell, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Now, on Tuesday, the National Audit Office released a new report on the financial management of the NHS, finding that the scale of challenges facing the National Health Service today and foreseeable in the years ahead is unprecedented, and that the NHS may be working at the limits of a system which might break before it is again able to provide patients with care that meets standards for timeliness and accessibility. It's a damning report backed up by language coming from the government. Here's Wes Streeting speaking the morning after Labour's landslide win.
This government will be honest about the challenges facing our country and serious about tackling them. From today, the policy of this department is that the NHS is broken. That is the experience of patients who are not receiving the care they deserve, and of the staff working in the NHS who can see that, despite giving their best, this is not good enough.
We know the NHS needs more money, but what else does it need? To help us answer that question, we're joined by Lord Victor Adebowale, a crossbench peer in the House of Lords and chair of the NHS Confederation, the membership body for health providers and commissioners in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Welcome to Pod Save the UK.
Hi, how are you doing?
Lord Victor is strong.
Well, Victor's fine. Unless you want to sell me something, and then it's Professor Lord Victor Adebowale, CBE. But Victor will do nicely.
Is that the full title?
Yeah, that'll do. Wow. Victor will do nicely. I'm not bothered about it. That's my name.
So, Victor, let's start with the National Audit Office report. What do you? It's a sobering read.
It is, yeah.
And I was drunk when I read it, in fairness, so it was quite useful for me. But yeah, it's a sobering read.
Not good for your health. Yeah.
It's a sobering read, right?
It is, yeah, absolutely.
It's tough news. What do you make of it?
Well, I'm not surprised by it, to be honest. And I think that the honesty, it's about time we had some honesty, and certainly me and my colleagues at the NHS Confed have been calling, actually the last government as well as this government, to be honest with the public about the state of the NHS. And this report sets it out pretty starkly, but there's nothing I'm surprised in. We've known for years the NHS has been underfunded for probably 10 years now. And then we had the pandemic. Before the pandemic, went into the pandemic with 100,000 vacancies in the NHS, and then 125,000 in social care. We had waiting lists that were rapidly in the multiples of millions before the pandemic. They've now gone up to 7.6. They've dropped slightly because of the Herculean efforts of NHS staff. But we've got a major challenge around social care, which is the major block to change. And then we had the junior doctor strike. So, if it wasn't broke, these things kind of broke it. So it doesn't surprise me now.
One of the government's key missions for the NHS is cutting waiting times. full fact, calculated that Labour's pledge of 40,000 more appointments a week works out as a yearly increase of 1.3%.
Yeah.
Is this target realistic, or is it not ambitious enough?
Well, it's a start.
Yeah.
I mean, to say that it's not ambitious enough seems a bit mean, given they've only been in government, 2 weeks. but it's a start, and the NHS is a large, complex system, and to think that you can just pull one lever and it'll work would be foolish. You have to pull many levers and in different sequences, and this is one which will help. You know, the fact of the matter is 95% of people who enter the NHS enter through primary care. So if you don't fix primary care, then the rest of the system takes the blunt.
And primary care is...
primary care doctors, GPs, you know,
Right.
go into your GP. Well, it's services that are the first port of call, really, when you're entering the NHS, which is usually your GP, but your GP plus other services like nurses, sometimes mental health, sometimes other interventions that take place in what we call primary care settings, first care settings.
So what does the government actually need to invest to cut these waiting times?
Yeah. Well, you know, my colleagues are very worried about the fact there's a £3 billion hole in the current budget between what they spend and what they need. So that needs to be plugged. Then you've got the state of the buildings, buildings and the things that you need. So I was in Doncaster, the Doncaster Infirmary, and it was appalling. I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that parts of the hospital are a death trap and just in an appalling state. And if you've got hospitals in that state, not only are they a really, really depressing and dangerous place to work, but actually you're undermining the efficiency of that hospital. So currently we spend about $7 billion a year on capital. We need to double that. We need $14 billion just to get the things that we need to fix in the capital estate fixed, so that we can then start to use hospital buildings more efficiently, more effectively, and actually start to bring down the waiting times.
And does that include building new hospitals? Because I know the Conservatives promised 40 new ones. They never got built. Is that included in this?
No, this is just maintaining the current state. There's a question, well, certainly in my mind, speaking about the new hospital programme and about how we define what a hospital is actually in the current age. Because let's be honest, and I'm speaking personally here, do you want to go to hospital? No. And I don't know anybody that does. So the question is, how do we bend the demand curve? And this is in the Audit Commission's report. How do you bend that demand curve so that we're dealing with people well before the need to go to hospital, such that they might never need to go to hospital, which is about preventative care. It's about care in the community. It's about actually providing you with the support you need to stay healthy and the information you need to stay healthy, as opposed to waiting until you get ill. And I think that's where we've got to go if we're going to save the NHS and do it properly. And that's what Wes is saying, and we generally agree with him.
That's the big culture shift, right? That various people who are experts in this field have been saying for a while needs to happen. Yeah,
that we need to start bending the demand curve. We need to start thinking about prevention.
Just explain, I definitely understand it, but for the benefit of any listeners that don't, please context.
Well, what I mean by that
is
that currently, you know, we have this winter crisis every year, and we pretend that winter's a surprise. It's not a surprise. It happens every year.
Oh my God, November!
And there you go, and it's horrific, and that puts pressure on the acute hospitals, and they do an amazing job, and we need them. But we've also got increased demand from an elderly population, which is increasingly suffering from multiple, what we call comorbidities, which means just lots of illnesses. And then we've got the problem of inequality and inequity, and it's just worth explaining the difference. So inequality is where you don't get equal treatment, right? That's fine, but inequity is where you don't get the treatment that's appropriate to your needs, right? And that has all kinds of implications. I mean, we're all brown people here. I'm a darker brown than you, but we're all brown people. What I can tell you, that people that look like us get a far worse treatment by both experience and outcomes than people that don't look like us. So all those things lead to a kind of demand on the NHS system, which ultimately results in the most expensive care being used, which is basically in hospital. And so what we need to start doing is resolving some of those issues, the inequity, the inequality, the social care demands brought about by an increasing elderly population, and the comorbidities. And in order to do that, we need to start bringing healthcare closer to you, closer to your community, actually helping you stay healthy so you don't need to get as ill or ill as quicker. And we need to do that in places that need it the most. So in London, I can tell you that a woman in Barking and Dagenham has an active life expectancy of 55 before they start sort of falling down. Their health starts to deteriorate. In Richmond upon Thames, it's over 70.
That's
not
I'm
sustainable.
from Barking and Dagenham.
There you go.
So
Yeah.
wow,
That's sobering news.
55.
It's not great.
All right, guys, come on. Look after me, yeah, Nish. Look after me. Be nice to me. Bring me apples.
Let's move to Richmond.
Well,
I think I'm not sure it's the living in Richmond that's the issue.
no, it's not just the living in Richmond, but it is the ability to afford expensive lycra and just do stuff.
Yeah.
And look after yourself and having a healthcare system that works for you. So that's what I mean by bending the demand curve.
And there was a story this week that said the births of babies to black women were twice as likely to have NHS investigations on them.
Again, unsurprising to me. I set up the Race and Health Observatory because I observed that and experienced that the fact that if you're black, your service is likely to be worse. But also, if you're a black employee of the NHS, I'm afraid your experience is likely to be worse. And during the pandemic, the first 10 people to die were all black, by which I mean brown people like us who worked in the NHS in the most dangerous parts of the NHS, and that continued. So I set up the Race and Health Observatory, which is part of the NHS Confed, so that we could actually get excuse removers to people who run the NHS to say this is unacceptable.
I think all of us on this sofa would have first-hand experience of knowing full well when you're asking for care that you're being second-guessed. Or do you really need those painkillers, miss? And all the different stereotypes that play into it.
Well, painkillers is a good one because there's very clear evidence that if you are black, you're less likely to get painkillers sufficiently because there's a weird belief that we can take it,
Jesus.
Which is just not good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and the pregnancy stuff is deeply shocking.
Yes.
It's not just women in pregnancy, by the way. It's also what happens to babies who are brown when they're born.
Yeah.
In order to test that you're healthy, they use something called the Apgar score, which is based on skin colour and was developed in the 50s, I think, when they just didn't look at brown or black babies. Well, they didn't look at black babies. When I say black, you all know what I mean. They just didn't look at black babies in the same way. So the Apgar score often made wrong readings, and it's not based on brown skin.
It's just when we've sort of picked just a few of the stories and the problems, and so then it just brought to mind how there was all that controversy about having like an LGBT flag on an NHS, or having things that speak to Black History Month or South Asian Heritage, and what a furore that caused. And you just think, well, actually, when those communities are being treated like this in the NHS as patients and employees, the least you can do is do a nice little lanyard, for God's sake.
It is bizarre, isn't it? But the notion of woke, I always consider that what's the opposite of not woke?
Sleep.
There you go.
Sounds good.
Who would you rather have looking after your NHS? It's not a difficult one, is it?
So let's talk about pay. Obviously, that's one of the biggest issues at the heart of the NHS. The government's making moves this week. West Streeting began formal negotiations with England's junior doctors. They've been demanding a pay rise of 35% and striking since March last year. And Chancellor Rachel Reeves has indicated that some NHS staff may be in for above-inflation pay rises. So why are these pay rises so important? And can you just talk about that number, 35%? Because I think there will be a lot of people who think, whoa, that's enormous.
It's a lot of money. Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I'm not here to do the negotiations on behalf of the government. The point is that the doctor strike has to be resolved. It's as simple as that. It's cost billions of pounds already, and it's caused the waiting list to increase, as well as causing great dissatisfaction amongst my junior colleague doctors. And the last government said, 35% is too much. But in other countries, Scotland being one of them, there has been a settlement. So it is possible to put this to bed. And the government has said that they're willing to do that. In my experience, the only way to resolve a dispute is to sit down and talk, right? And you know that you've reached a good point when both parties are unhappy, but you've got a settlement.
Yeah.
That's what it's got to get to. That's what it's got to get to.
In a way, it's part of the general disgrace of Rishi Sunak's time as Prime Minister, that in order to make a sort of political point about how tough he was, he sort of stonewalled a lot of those conversations. Do you see a kind of optimism now, because at least there's a willingness for people to meet at the table?
There's a notion that increasing public sector pay causes inflation. I've yet to see the economic evidence to support that. I mean, I think that it's really quite dodgy on the one hand. On the other hand, and I'm speaking personally now rather than as the chair of the NHS Confed, but my view is that austerity is a very expensive way to run a country. Yeah. And we're seeing, not just in the NHS, but across public services, the cost of that, because all you're doing is putting off the cost, unless you're prepared to see people dying early, unless you're prepared to see, your streets fall apart, crime, then it's a very expensive way to run a country. Yeah. So in the NHS, what we're seeing is really the results of two things: massive increase in demand and a massive reduction in resourcing over more than a decade. And you arrive at a point where you have to fix both things at the same time, and that's going to cost money. But it's not just about money, it's also about reform. It's about changing what you do for the current era. We do need to change the way we deliver healthcare in this country, and we need to get better value for the money that we spend, and we need to create a healthier nation. And in that, we welcome the Keir Starmer's sort of mission approach, which is you only get healthcare if you have health in every policy. You need a health creating nation, as opposed to just doing nothing and leaving it to the NHS. Because the NHS only deals with about 20% really of health. The rest of it's created by other things: housing, social care, employment, transport. All these things contribute to health, and if they're not contributing to better health, then they're costing us.
Well, I mean, you can't have wealth without health.
There you go.
They rhyme for a reason.
No, you're taking the words out of my mouth. I'm very clear about that. You cannot have wealth without health. And in fact, the waiting times that we've got at the moment, which are well over 7 million, are actually contributing to poor economic growth and poor productivity. Because for every one of those people that can't work, you've got somebody looking after them who equally can't work, and you've got somebody looking after the person looking after them who can't work. Yeah. So it just brings the whole thing down. Yeah,
absolutely. I do just want to go back to that 35% though, just because as I understand it, part of that number, which may seem shocking, is because it's taking into consideration what other countries pay doctors. Now, we pay doctors and nurses much, much worse.
Yeah, it depends which countries you look at.
True.
But we certainly pay them more than they do in many African countries and South Asian countries.
But isn't international poaching a major problem?
It is, yeah.
Because that's the staff retention problem here. But we've got 100,000 vacancies across the NHS. Yeah. There's been a 168% increase since 2014 in staff leaving for work-life balance. Yeah. What's the solution? I mean, this seems like an insurmountable problem.
Well, it's not insurmountable, and I don't believe that that's the case at all. I think that if you look at it's not just about pay. Yeah, it's also about the conditions in which they work. It's also about something called moral harm. Now, if you allow me to explain moral harm.
Please.
So what happened during COVID was that this became a real issue. People who work in the NHS want to help people. That's why they become nurses and doctors, and they have a moral mission in a sense. And when they can't do that, because of the conditions in which they work, it affects them. It affects them emotionally, and it affects them morally, because you want to do what you're trained to do and what you want to do, but you can't. And you're watching people die and you're watching people get ill because you haven't got the resources, and that has an impact on your emotional, mental, and actually often physical health. Now, there are things that you can do about that. One of them is to acknowledge that it's happening rather than ignore it. The second thing is to allow the people that are suffering to explain how and why they're suffering and to debrief. And then the third thing is that you talk to them about how they can have more control over their jobs, over their roles, over how they work, how choices are made, give them how to design the work better from their point of view. And then you regularly reflect on that to learn with them. And so there are things that you can do and that we will need to do that aren't just about paying people more or changing. It's about actually listening and listening. If I tell you I'm listening, that's great, but you need evidence that you've been heard, right? Yeah. And that kind of engagement with frontline staff, I think, is going to be necessary.
I went and did some fundraising stuff in the kind of local hospital in Croydon where I grew up. And I was just talking to a member of staff who worked there on the administrative side. And this would have been in 2022. And I said, how is everybody? And she said, do you really want to know? And I said, yes. And she said, I think all the medical and non-medical staff here all need to be treated for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
Because doctors, as they enter the profession, understand that they will be put in situations where they have to make life or death decisions. But this was multiple times per day. They were picking which patient was going to get the ventilator.
That's right.
And the whole staff of that hospital, medical and non-medical, were exhibiting signs of a trauma response, which when you actually consider what was going on, makes total sense.
Correct.
And I haven't really heard a huge amount of discussion about that.
You're hearing it now.
Yeah, that's great.
I do think that it's really important that we do acknowledge the state of the front line and the managers as well. It's been a struggle, and it still is.
Let's talk about physician associates, right?
Oh, crikey.
So physician associates, I'll be honest, I haven't really heard this term before. I understand it's a new role. They are healthcare professionals that work underneath a senior doctor, and there appears to be a push to try and get patients to see these people as their primary care, as you defined it earlier. So we actually wanted to hear from some doctors directly. We're not going to share their names, but there's a question from a doctor about this issue. And they said, according to research published by the Royal College of GPs in June this year, 6 out of 10 job-seeking GPs have struggled to find a vacancy to apply for. This seems to be a funding issue where if a practice wants to expand their team, they're essentially forced to employ a physician associate. How is the NHS going to fix the issue of GPs not being able to find work?
Well, I mean, Wes has talked about more appointments for GPs. There's been more attention to primary care. Indeed, the first place he went to was a primary care service, which is great. My organisation is working quite hard with primary care networks on ensuring that GP practices can operate efficiently. Look, I'm aware of the controversy, and I'm aware that some GPs and clinicians are very concerned about somebody referred to it in an email to be dumbing down and replacing them. I don't necessarily agree that that's the case. I really don't. I think you could argue that the increased clinical responsibilities and work of nurses in primary care settings, GP settings, and others could be argued was a dumbing down of the GP. I don't think that's the case. I think we have to wait. I think we have to listen to what clinical colleagues are saying, but change isn't always easy.
I can't speak for this person, but isn't the issue that they're sort of alluding to here is that there seems to be a prioritising of cheaper staff, basically?
I don't think that's the case.
Right.
I mean, our members are very concerned. This is why when I talk about the 3 billion gap between expenditure and, that's what I'm talking about. We're talking about leaders in the NHS having to cut clinical staff, not just administrative staff, clinical services. And of course, it does lead to decisions being made cheap against, appropriate. And that's why they're worried about the 3 billion. We need the 3 billion to keep the show on the road currently as we approach winter. We don't want another winter crisis. So I think an element of what you're saying is displaying kind of the general concern. We need some money now.
In the past, Wes Streeting has suggested that Labour government might need to look to the private sector to bring down waiting times. Is that something that could be useful, or is that something that actually ends up being more expensive for the NHS in the long term?
Well, first of all, if you're in agony, and I know people who are in agony, you're not going to be too bothered about whether
of course.
Really not, firstly. Secondly, most private care is done at the same price as NHS care. It's what's called a tariff.
Yeah.
So it's not more expensive, right? Yeah. And thirdly, the NHS already, through the way in which we employ GPs as private contractors working for it. So I think it's the wrong argument, to be honest. The argument, if we're going to have one, has to be about value for money and how we get value for money rather than, whether it's point A or point B that provides the service. And with Wes, when he argues that he's not going to allow the waiting list to go up because of ideology.
But I mean, and listen, I'm not an economist.
Neither am I, so don't ask me an economics question because you won't get an answer.
Private services, primarily, yes, of course they deliver care, but they are run for profit. That is the point. And so there will be a certain amount, 10%, 12%, 25%, I don't know what the profit margins are, that will just go to pay off shareholders or whatever it is. That money, if it was all done in the public service, would be back in the public service. That would be 20%. So how can anyone say it costs the same? It doesn't make sense.
You're talking about where the money goes, not how much it costs. So the tariff for private sector providers of elective surgery is exactly the same as it is for the NHS. The issue then becomes do they make a profit?
Exactly. How are they doing it?
And I don't know because I don't run a private healthcare service.
It's got to be a worse service.
Is this: no, it's not a worse service because in 1997 when the Labour government got in, one of the things that they had to do to bring down the waiting list was bring in the private sector to provide actually mainly hip operations and knee operations. For a period of time, they contracted with the private sector to bring down those waiting times, and it worked. And if you need a new hip, believe me, you need the operation. Mm-hmm. So it worked, and then they wound it down. So it was, in my personal view, an appropriate use of the private sector that actually added value to the NHS. For the patient, it was free at the point of access. And yes, the private sector made a profit. It'd be, in an ideal world, you wouldn't need them because the NHS would be fully funded. But we're not living in an ideal world. We're living in an far from ideal world, and the NHS needs intervention. What I would say in closing, that I happen to be the chair of the Social Enterprise UK. Now, social enterprises are businesses, like any other business, but they don't have any shareholders. And something like 39% of all community services, mental health services, substance misuse services are provided by social care and social enterprises. And we could be and should be doing more with social enterprises to ease the pressure on the NHS. And I think we probably will be. So it's not all private care, profiteering and what have you. Quite a lot of it is provided by people that actually work for the NHS, alongside the NHS, but aren't distributing profit.
It's good to hear of the reminders of those success stories. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one that after everything that happened with COVID and people running away with money to provide certain medical-related services, and they essentially defrauded the country, you can see why the average citizen, myself included, is sceptical and nervous.
I think I'm the average citizen. Last time I looked, I'm a member of the House of Lords. So
listen, you're a lord.
Bit tricky, but I'm still average.
He's your average lord.
But honestly, I'm with you. I thought, I mean, just mentioning it makes my blood boil.
Yeah.
It was, some of the stuff that went on was outrageous. But let's not confuse that with the need to basically provide people with care when they need it, free at the point of access. And if we need to bring in private sector providers to get the waiting list under control, let's do it.
Victor, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Save the UK.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Trump's attempted assassination shocked not only the US, but the world. And in many ways, it signals growing political violence worldwide.
On last week's episode of Pod Save the World, hosts Tommy Vitor and Ben Rhodes dive into the international implications and what the future holds now that Trump has picked his vice president. Head to the Pod Save the World feed now to listen. Now, last week, the streets of Leeds were unfortunately met with a riot after a state intervention from social services took one family's children into care. Anger quickly erupted, leading to smashed police cars and a burnt-out bus. Something no one wants to see, and it's certainly not a situation for the permanent gonorrhea of British politics to wade in on. We don't want to talk about him. We were trying not to mention him by name, but he has been recently elected to Parliament as the leader of a far-right party. And he had an opinion on this, which may not surprise you.
I think we need to discuss a new name for him.
Yeah.
I know we didn't want to talk about him and we don't want to mention his name, but he is going to continue to do these things that deserve calling out. Yeah. So what are we going to go for? What are we going to call him? Our producer James has given a suggestion, nasty effer.
Yeah.
Although I keep misreading it and thinking he's saying the heifer.
Like he's a cow. Let's not besmirch cows.
No, cows are great. And then I went on to Google to look up names that we could possibly give him. Yeah. And I came across a now defunct Facebook page called Ed Miliband's. And it's from 2015. It was a different time, okay? It was a different time. Facebook, Ed Miliband. And there was one post that just said, I think we should all start calling Nigel Farage Nital because he's a boring cunt that puts you to sleep.
Why is she allowed to say cunt?
I'm quoting. That's not my phrase. I mean, it's weird when you even see that, because on a serious point, obviously that was 2015. So the idea you would just describe me as like a boring, monotonous person who puts you to sleep is so like generous to him, because he's actually much more mendacious, isn't he?
Yeah.
But Nigel's not a bad start. So in lieu of that, let's talk about Nigel, the member for Clacton.
Well, the member for Clacton decided to tweet about the riots in Leeds, whilst obviously doing important work for the local community he now represents by going to America to attend the Republican National Convention. He tweeted, "The politics of the subcontinent are currently playing out on the streets of Leeds. Don't say I didn't warn you." Alex Sobel, who's the Labour MP for Leeds, replied, "This is a situation you know nothing about and no one has briefed you on. You are inflaming a situation with misinformation. Politicians have a responsibility to not exacerbate situations, particularly with no knowledge of them. I expect you to issue an apology." To which the fuckwit replied, "When will you and the Labour Party apologise for irresponsible mass migration?" Now, look, this is an evolving situation in Leeds, which needs to be discussed, but it needs to be discussed when there's more information that's available. What we definitely know is that this issue has absolutely nothing to do with the South Asian communities in this country. And so the phrase which absolutely drips with colonial contempt, the phrase, the politics of the subcontinent, which could not be more redolent of imperial nostalgia of a kind that is the only thing capable of raising an erection from that particular gentleman. It is unbelievable that he's been allowed to use this. And I know that, and I understand that his whole career is essentially based on making people like me angry. But owning the libs, or whatever you want to call it, is one thing when your job is essentially to do that for a conservative news broadcasting organisation. He's a member of parliament. He should now be held to the standard of a person who holds public office. It is an absolute disgrace that he posted this. It is an absolute disgrace. And it is quite astonishing, this idea that he's able to spread misinformation and we seem to have no recourse to do anything about it, given that he's a member of parliament. The invocation of the politics of the subcontinent is, to my mind, a piece of uncomplicated racism. I mean, I have the same thoughts, and I keep wondering: is he less accountable now that he's an MP? Do you know what I mean? Like, where do we go for it? When he was spouting his crap on GB News, at least you could write to Ofcom. I mean, not that anything would come of it, but you kind of knew where you were meant to go to challenge these things and hope for some kind of consequence. Not that they ever really came, or certainly not enough to stop him spreading these kind of vicious lies. The unrest was triggered after children from a Roma family were taken into care, and there are obviously very serious questions that need to be asked about the way that authorities handle that community. There are serious questions to be asked about the background to all of this, but that needs to only happen when we have more information about it. What we definitely know is this has absolutely nothing to do with the South Asian community. Back to the comments though, as I understand it, at this moment in time, as we record on the Wednesday, they're still up. This man has shown no contrition. I mean, now that it's all been revealed that this was not actually anything to do with that community. And, you know, he doesn't show contrition. He won't regret it. He'll probably just dig deep and do more of it. So I think there is, A, it's worth us calling it out. And B, if you are also incensed about it, listeners, maybe we should tell our MPs how upset we are about it. And maybe someone should bring it up in Commons, because it is absolutely disgusting. So consider this the beginning of our first campaign against Nigel. Please write to your MP. Please write to them and say, this guy said racist things. Can it be brought up in Commons? Absolutely,
because
100%.
I think it is worth causing a fuss about this.
Listen, after all the years of Conservative chaos and the weeks of campaigning and the government voting this week to keep Tory policies, it still hasn't quite hit me that we actually have a new government. And I don't think I'm alone. Here is the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, speaking in the House of Commons on Monday.
And in relation to the particular point, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, old habits die hard. The point that the Leader of the Opposition put me on security and cooperation.
There's something very Labour about even the Labour Party can't believe it's in government.
It's better that it was that way around, because imagine if Rishi Sunak referred to himself as the Prime Minister. I mean, it can't get worse for him, but that would be horrible, terribly embarrassing.
But listen, all of us could be forgiven for thinking not much has changed, given how some Conservatives have been acting. Here is a clip from the Commons this week where freshly minted Environment Secretary Steve Reid was attempting to address the Commons.
And rebuild our NHS with 40,000 more appointments every week. 8,500.
For our podcast listeners, the yelling you can just hear is Shadow Secretary of State for Health, Victoria Atkins, jumping up to interrupt and bashing the dispatch box.
Order! Steve. The Right Honourable Lady has behaved abominably. Secretary of State.
There were whispers that Victoria Atkins might have fancied herself as the new leader of the opposition, but that was not necessarily a fantastic way to launch your campaign, just smashing the dispatch box and yelling in the middle of Steve Reid trying to make a point about just basic things the government is planning to do. It was very strange.
Yeah, it was a bit like the "you what, mate" form of leadership.
Yeah,
What'd you say? What'd you say to me, mate? I get that we're all looking for new forms of leadership. Not what I was expecting, the kind of pub brawl style. But it also does reflect something, which is like, the standards are really low, the standards in Commons at the moment.
Well, I mean, I did read that I think at this point, 1 in 4 Conservative MPs is now part of the shadow cabinet because of the numbers of them that remain. The talent pool is shallow. Shall we say, in terms of looking for the next Tory leader. That process has been kicked down the road until November after the party conference in October. So far, only James Cleverly has announced that he will officially be running for Tory leadership, but presumably between now and November, we'll hear names start to come in. And we will all be frantically Googling them because we have simply not heard of a lot of these people because the Tory party has been decimated largely by its own doing at the last election. So until then, the Prime Minister, leader of the opposition, Rishi Sunak, will remain in post.
So he will just continue looking at pictures of California as a screensaver. I can just imagine him just like slideshow of Monterey, slideshow of Miami Beach.
It's a fascinating situation he's in. He's so rich. And yet he still has to turn up to do this job. It's a very strange sort of weirdly, like he's in a sort of purgatorial situation.
Well, luckily for us, lucky for him, he's AI. So he's basically a robot. So I guess it's fine. That's it. Thank you for listening to Pod Save the UK.
Well, thank you, Coco. Thank you to all of us. I don't know. I thought you were going to read the rest of that. That bit of the script, but you just sort of lost faith in it.
I read this sentence and then I was like, "Oh, not my line. I'll step back."
It felt like you were. Well, listen. I don't want to throw too much of a glimpse behind the magician's cloth, but sometimes there are scripted lines that we obviously read in, and some of them are allocated to me and some of them are allocated to Coco. But normally, what happens is one of us starts reading something the other one was supposed to read and just carries on, and we switch that process round. But today, Coco's just been like, "Not my line. I'm just going to stop."
I'll start it, but I won't finish. It's like the opposite of the mastermind approach. So do you want me to finish it?
Yeah, I would like.
Okay. And that's it. Thanks for listening to Pod Save the UK. Also, we want to hear your thoughts and your ideas for what we should be calling the member of Clacton. Email us at psuk@reducedlisting.co.uk or drop us a voice note on WhatsApp. Our number is, what's our number, Nish? Do it without looking. 07494
933 444.
Yes, come on.
Internationally, that's +44
He's looking me straight in the eye.
7494 933 444.
You looked down. I saw you cheating.
Right at the end.
Don't forget to follow us at Pod Save the UK. I did that one from memory. That one's really easy.
It's just the name of the show.
There's signs all around us saying Pod Save the UK. Like, look at me, I remember the handle.
Thanks for joining us on our new YouTube channel. Hit that subscribe button and ring that bell for notifications when we drop new content.
And don't be afraid to drop us a comment below to let us know what you think of the issues we've discussed today and, crucially, funny names for the member of Clacton.